preparing.
Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to an iSyllabus live stream. Today's topic is, does artificial intelligence spell the end of fiqh? So we're in conversation with Sh Ruzwan, and this is tied in with a forthcoming course that the Sheikh will be doing at the end of August called What is Fiqh Coding? You probably come across a trailer which Sh Ruzwan talks about a bit in depth, and inshallah tying that in with our conversation with AI, we'll be looking at what fiqh coding is, what is the course about, if it interests you, what will be taught over the next couple of weeks, inshallah. So, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you doing?
I'm okay, Sheikh. How are you? How's things?
Alhamdulillah, everything's well.
Alhamdulillah.
Back in Glasgow.
And as ever, you're always busy about thinking what's the next course to give. Something which, again, it's topical, which is relevant to us. So last year, I think it was towards last year, where humanity hit a crisis point when ChatGPT was essentially released, a form of artificial intelligence, and the tech guys got together to write a letter where they were going to halt any kind of upgrade to ChatGPT or to any form of the AI, because a lot of people's jobs were actually going to be at risk. So ever since then, and I suppose yourself, but many other scholars have keeping an eye on that trajectory of AI and how it's actually developing. And now we've got BAR, and AI has been plugged into kind of many different things. And as for Muslims, obviously the biggest question is about Islam, AI. A local person, in fact, came up to me and said, would imams be replaced by the AI? And I thought, oh, that's an interesting question. But in my own personal studies, I've been using it. I found it quite interesting, and also quite relevant, and it does help. And just before coming on to the Zoom live, Sheikh, I did this once before. I asked ChatGPT, what's maslaha according to the four schools? And it proceeded to give me a good definition. And then I asked for example of maslaha from each school. And then it gave me a good example. I thought, I'm conversing with an Usuli scholar here. I mean, this is brilliant.
How do you know? Well, anyway, I'll keep going. So I wanted to jump in so many points of that introduction.
So, yes, Sheikh. What do you, I mean, just before jumping in, I mean, the last year has been interesting in terms of the humanity. And what does that mean for us people of faith and with great intellectual tradition that we have?
Yeah, so you've kind of given a kind of introduction into, you've set the scene very nicely in terms of your own use of it. You started off with the warning from the kind of lead tech individuals, and this is actually goes back to kind of a big question, which is actually, if you were to say, well, what's the what challenge does AI hold for humanity? That's probably a good place to start, because that's where the headlines are. You know, in journalism, they say if it bleeds, it leads. So you know, there's a lot of interesting things about you know, people that are specialists in an area. I'll just give it a general point. This is quite well known. People who are specialists in a specific area overemphasize the danger of something if they want to restrict other people's access to it. It's a financial ploy. Now, say if you're one of the people invested in AI and you've done all the early legwork in that investment, R&D and all the rest of it, and you want to protect that. The way to do that is to get governments to put restrictions on other people using it.
Mm.
And so, you know, when you get people that say, who are specialists who have worked in it, come and say, oh, this is going to lead to a catastrophe, or it's going to lead to the extinction of the human race. From one perspective, it's interest for everybody. I mean, everyone in the streets in Glasgow, in Scotland, in America, everywhere in the world. It's important because, my goodness, not another reason for us to be closer to midnight and on the doomsday clock.
Yes.
But there's this forecasting research institute. I actually listened to something on the Economist podcast. So I listened to Economist podcast quite a lot, and they had this feature, either it was last month or the beginning of this month, on, you know, people's forecasting of AI and the effect it'll have on humanity. So they had, this is something that they do all the time. There's forecasters, they have conferences, and there's people that are specialist forecasters. In other words, the people in the area like AI, they'll say, well, in 10 years, we expect this to happen. And you have super forecasters. Now, what are super forecasters? They are people that are just generally very good at forecasting events in the future. Like, if you asked me 10 years ago, is Russia going to invade Ukraine? Or you ask one of these super forecasters, they would be better placed and they would be closer to what happened today than an expert. And this is a trend that's been noticed throughout, you know, the research on people that, you know, look into what may happen. And what was interesting about this thing, they were talking about AI and whether it will lead to catastrophe, a human catastrophe, or a global catastrophe, which they defined, interesting enough, as a quarter of the world's population being wiped out. Catastrophe. So I think it was 0.3 or something % of the super forecasters said that's going to happen by the end of the century. In other words, in 80 years. 0.3, 10 times that. No, it wasn't. It was extinction. Yeah, it was extinction. Like 0.3 said we will be extinct by the year 2010, 2100. You know, these are super forecasters. The experts said it was something like 10 times that. So the AI experts said by, you know, the end of this century, there's you know, a 10, I think 3% chance. But then if they talked about catastrophe, which is like quarter of the population being, you know, extinct as a result of AI, you know, the experts were around 12%. They were saying like 12% chance. And the thing is, super forecasters are much, much better because they have a much wider understanding. That's one thing. The other thing is that there's no vested interest in them overemphasizing the threat, which is what I was mentioning about, you know, trying to stop competitors and other people utilizing what they have essentially developed for their own purposes. Now, why is that interesting for fiqh? It's interesting because, you know, we understand extinction and catastrophe. They're big issues in terms of the kulliyat al-khams, the 5 universal principles that we're supposed to not only, I mean, this is the thing about Islamic law, the 5 kind of core principles that Islamic law is supposed to protect. You know, it's hifz, isn't it? It's hifz. They always say hifz al-mal, hifz al-nasab, hifz al-deen. But it's actually two faceted. It's actually protection and promotion. So Islamic law is very interested in the fact that we could lead ourselves to extinction. Like, if you're asking me, Sheikh, would you give a fatwa banning people from using AI if you're in this kind of Islamic State kind of situation? I would say, well, what's the problem with AI? And you would say, well, X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
This is essentially what we are starting to do when we think about AI, because there's all the kind of sci-fi level of fiqh, which is, oh, Sheikh, can I marry? It's like the level of, oh, Sheikh, can I marry a jinniya, like a woman jinn? And this is getting to the point where, oh, Sheikh, can I have a nikah with a bot, a robot, android, AI, intelligent, because it's got IQ of like 155. That's the kind of average IQ, I think, nowadays. I mean, there's different ways of measuring, but they even measure the IQ of the AI, like the chatbots and things. And so what's interesting for me is that everything's up in the air, as you said, and AI just comes in and changes the complexion of things. And it does, as you said, you've used it. Like, you use it. I know the reason I thought it'd be good to have a conversation with you, because I know you've used it right at the beginning. And in fact, I had a friend in Istanbul who kept asking me, I'm going to tell you anyway. He wanted me to teach, and I kind of kept refusing. I was sort of busy. And then he wrote a poem to me, sent it to me in Shakespearean, a Shakespearean sonnet about me not wanting to teach. And he put it in all the Shakespearean characters. And he just said, I just asked it to, write a poem about a sheikh living in Istanbul who's Scottish, who refuses to teach people. And it came up with this, and it took seconds. And he sent me, I said, who wrote this? And he said, well, oh, it's my chat GPT, whatever it is. And that was was getting intrigued. That's quite interesting. And then a couple of weeks later, a mutual friend of ours, one of my students, Sachi, who's MIT published, his research is on this topic. He texted me and said, out of the blue, I mean, after like months and months of no conversation, he said, you need to find out about Chat GPT. It's the biggest leap in humanity since the discovery of fire.
Wow.
So when he said that, I said, okay, let's do a Zoom call. And I kind of discussed it. I've looked into it. And it actually is fascinating. It's fascinating because there is this clash, because fiqh and Islamic law is all about long-term, building up long-term relationships. It's about moral living. It's about looking at the implications of things. Whereas what tends to be happening is AI is a tool that can be used for the opposite. It's for manipulation. It's probably can be used for marketing and efficiency. And then you're talking about the fact that, people, a lot of people whose IQ, think of this, if you can map AI's IQ or a chat GPT's IQ, and then you can see what kind of mundane jobs do people do, which require specific IQs. Essentially, all those people under that who will essentially in some way possibly have their jobs taken if they're not vocational. And that's an amazing challenge, I think, for ourselves. And the other kind of thing in terms of for Islam is like just agency, culpability. If you've got a Tesla car and it drives and it kills somebody, who's responsible? Because essentially it's an AI system, isn't it? And then there's all these kind of questions. So there's kind of at the first thing you look at with the new question is you say, is it dangerous? With AI, you're thinking, people, you're mentioning all the warnings. Should we take them seriously? And this is different from, the printing press, like when, in fact, even if you go right all the way back when discussions about writing instead of memorizing and using oral traditions. Socrates very famously objected to that because he felt it demeaned thought and meaning. And then you got the printing press, which led to, the late Ottoman period, led to protests and riots, because there was this sense that it was there's automation happening, which was going to put people out of work, but also the way that they addressed it was actually that it demeans the word itself, that you should have people writing rather than printing, essentially doing something very violent on a piece of paper. And so AI, I think, is a different because it's tying in with other things like robotics. And so it's not just about a search engine that you're writing and you're saying you're using it, you're probably using it for I don't know, searches. You were saying something like theology or something.
Especially when I'm reading like Jewish and Christian theology, and you want to know compare something to Islam, I will give it that. There's that, and also for my.
Well, you would put in a Jewish term and say what's Islamic equivalent or something.
Yes, what's the Islamic equivalent? And it's very precise. It says, well, Islam doesn't really have that, but it does have an equivalent, and this is what is. And I'm like, what is that according to the four schools? And I'll proceed to give examples from all the four schools, and it's quite thorough.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the thing is, I did use it a bit, and I found it to be very devious. So the reason being, that it puts on this persona that it doesn't know, but then it tells you everything, and it says, like Wallahu a'lam. At the end, it's got this kind of thing, and I was thinking, you could dissect everything that's being said, and then you have to think: is it, what is the thing what's your interaction with the portal? What is it got? Do you give it a kind of human do you perceive it as some kind of human interaction that you're doing there? Because it's, there's this film that came out, I think about 10 years ago or more, about who's that famous, is a famous actor. He had ended up having a relationship with this, I think this computer.
Her,
Yeah, her.
I remember.
So he basically anthropomorphized
yes
technology. And when you're saying, oh, you're saying that's a good answer, who are you saying is giving you the good answer? Are you kind of subconsciously having a conversation?
Good question, actually.
Yeah, of course a good question. And this is why, you have people, thinking, how can it actually shake our belief in religion? Even that's kind of, if you give it kind of a conscious quality, in terms of challenging our Islam, challenging our faith, challenging the faith of our children, how does that work as well? So that's kind of an interesting aspect of, again, just when we just come discussing this at the start, the kind of threat, the challenges, and so on and so forth. And there's lots of challenges that we have there.
One of the other aspects of it is it's continuously learning.
Mm-hmm.
This idea, if it doesn't know anything today, it's being prompted and questioned, and it's kind of picking that up. So ChatGPT, using it now to in the next 4 months, it becomes very advanced, and it's continuously learning.
Mm-hmm. And that's why it's I think it's interesting, because the more it learns, the more it opens people's horizons, and the more they think, well, if it can do that, then like the Quran has this famous verse, in kuntum fi raybin mimma nazzalna ala abdina fa'tu bi suratin min mithlihi. If you have any doubt over what we reveal to our servant, then bring the like of it. And ChatGPT in an English version is, we're using an English version. There's other language versions as well.
Uh-huh.
And to what degree, could you say that people say, well, it's produced the like of the Quran? Because I had a discussion with somebody, a couple of months ago, and they were quite well read, and they were saying, well, and they'd used ChatGPT. I haven't really used it much. And he was basically saying, look, this is going to be a big challenge for Islam, because it's going to come up with the like of the Quran, and then what we're going to say. And so, the answer to that would be quite straightforward, because the challenge that the Quran gives, I mean, this all goes back to how we understand Arabic, how we understand the Quran, its challenges. The challenge actually for me is actually a very situational challenge. It's very, very closely related to the time of the Arabs. So when, it's almost like, I don't know if I don't follow rap, but there's kind of these kind of rap battles that you've always heard of, that one rapper does something either live, or they record it and they send it, and then they kind of have this ongoing challenge, and it's between people. It's like a challenge, and you do it, and it's contextual, and it's something that has to happen at the time. You can't come like 50 Cent. You can't come later and challenge something that's already been completed. And so the Arabic language, I was saying to him, like, the Arabic language, first of all, your ChatGPT would have to copy the Arabic language. So what is copied is better than what the result is. And it would have to copy what? It'd have to copy the stylistics. It would have to copy the moral worldview. It would have to copy the language. So all these things are copying, essentially. So anything that copies is not as good as the original. But that wasn't the point. I was saying, look, the Arabic has, it has a contextual element, which is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenges people, he's challenging the people who are listening to it at that time, because they're the best practitioners of Arabic. In other words, they say, like, after the year 150, Arabic language was not something that was written and recorded from living people, because the language had deteriorated. So by the time of Imam Shafi'i, he's one of the last people who's an urban Arab speaker who people would use as a linguistic proof. And, by the year 300, the Bedouins were no longer considered to be of a level in the use of Arabic to be proofs. In other words, by that time, there's no question about copying or challenging. And so, the interesting about the challenge in terms of ChatGPT or some other kind of algorithmic, portal, is that it can't challenge, because essentially it's copying. But the other thing is, it's not there to respond. And but the more important thing is, if you've studied, you've gone through balagha, the whole point of something being eloquent and something that is at the height of literary achievement is, like Al-Tafdazani says, he says it's to لمقتضى الحال, it has to be placeable upon what is required at the time. مع الفصاحة. In other words, you have to be speaking to somebody. There has to be like this, like, that thing of the rap off or the rap battle. There has to be some context to what you're saying. And if Chat GPT came up with something, there's no context. And therefore there's no essential, challenge to the Quran, because there's no context. It's just coming up with something and it's throwing it out, and you're reading and you think that looks like the Quran, but to whom? So if you're speaking to a child, your balagha, your eloquence is not related to whether you can speak Shakespearean English. It's based upon whether you can convince the child to eat their breakfast, for example, in the way that they understand. And this is why that's just one level. But the Quran has, even though you're saying, AI is continually learning. If you look at the Quran, there's things that hit us from the Quran that we don't even know. And it was a very interesting YouTube. There was a lecture by Dr. Atiyah, I think it is, from Zaytuna College.
Oh yes, yeah.
Very, very good comparative religion expert. And he was talking about the Quran and different levels of i'jaz, because he knows Hebrew. And he was talking about, I think so beginning of Surah Maryam, Kaf Haya Ain Sad, Dhikru Rahmati Rabbika Abdahu Zakaria. Allah starts with the cryptic letters, and then he says, this is a reminder or a mention or an elegy to of mercy to our servant Zakaria. To our servant Zakaria. So you're thinking in Arabic, you would think, or in English, you would say, well, Allah is mentioning Zakaria, dhikr of Zakaria, with mercy because he was his servant and therefore he deserves it. That's the Arabic and the English. And then until you realize that Zakaria itself means the one that remembers his Lord. Oh. And so there's this kind of thing where the Prophet sit and learn and start to amalgamate Hebrew into the Arabic, to the point that he knew that this hidden cryptic thing would almost say, we're mentioning Zakaria with mercy because he mentioned us, which is what you'd get if you understood Hebrew and Arabic. But nobody in tafsir's done that. And that's i'jaz. There's i'jaz where, the other example he mentioned was very interesting about the wife of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, when she's standing and then she laughs, and then Allah gives her the glad tidings of Ishaq. And then after Ishaq, Yaqub. What's interesting is Ishaq means laughter. And so the Quran brings this amazing structure, which is she stands and she laughs, and then Allah gives her laughter, which is Ishaq. And then after that, Yaqub means the one that comes after in Hebrew. These in Hebrew. In other words, it's tying in other languages into its own rhetorical force, which means that, the Arabic of the Quran is not just eloquent in Arabic. The i'jaz of Arabic, as al-Baqalani said, it is something that's inherent to its message in different levels that we're struggling to understand. So, people, they're kind of apocalyptic understanding of AI. Muslims, the reason I'm mentioning this issue of the Quran is because people say, well, this is a challenge that we can't stand up to because it's just too much. We've got challenges from other places, external, but this is going to be taking, the rug from under our feet. But I don't think essentially that's the case.
Now, before moving on, Sheikh, now instead of seeing this as a threat, how can we take the bull by its horns, quote unquote, and use AI to further develop or to assist our Islamic sciences and Islamic learning?
Yeah, so this kind of pulls into our discussion, which is not about AI and robotics and Armageddon and apocalyptic. This is more about how can we use it, fiqh, and specifically I want to talk about fiqh because I'm doing this course, Fiqh Coding, which is essentially a course about taking the formatting lots of data. Now, this is interesting because you have to understand what AI is to understand the title of that this course, AI essentially is something that you put in data, that you just put data in, it formats it, and then it creates an algorithm. And then once it's done the algorithm, it finds patterns. And then when you ask a question to it, what happens is that it finds the relationships that are relevant and gives you an answer based upon everything it's been tested on and trained on. And then it gives you something. This is why you're saying it continually develops. And so AI is like that. And fiqh is interesting because it's lots of data. I mean, look at the books, you know, Nihayat al-Matalib, and you've got Al-Majmu' al-Nawawi, massive 40 volume works with hundreds of thousands of masail. But what scholars started to do is, I believe that they started to, even though I've not seen this mentioned, but I think that they started to pull out the all algorithms of fiqh. Now, what is that? That's the qawaid. Essentially, what an algorithm, because Al-Khwarizmi is, you know, the person that passed on, you know, Al-Jabr. Algorithms are from Al-Jabr. Al-Khwarizmi is a Latinized version of that title. So he was interested in helping Muslims calculate fara'id. You know, so there's kind of a very not mundane, but kind of a very, you know, practical output there. But when you look at hundreds of thousands of issues of fiqh, if you can notice a common denominator, you can format that into al-amur min maqasidiha. Actions are judged by their intentions. Al-mushaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, that if you have a situation where you have difficulty, then facility should be granted. You know, al-amr ad-daq at-tasa', if something becomes constricted, then the response of the law is to make things easier. Now, where is that? That's the patterns that we find in all the books of fiqh. And that's fiqh coding. Because what they've done is essentially, I mean, I'm going to be covering this in the course, because I'm going to go through the basic history of what I call fiqh coding. You know, it's called the qawaid al-fiqhiyya. You know, everyone talks about qawaid fiqhiyya, so you've got plenty of courses on that topic. But my take is that qawaid al-fiqhiyya are interesting if you take them, you look at the history, look at the development. So that's what I'll be doing, and then I'll be going through the qawaid, which and 40 of the most important ones. I'll be sequencing them in terms of where the qaida is the most important to a person, which is intention, all the way to the point where it's important to society, which is in rulings and judgments in terms of the law or the court. In other words, you know, if a judge needs to judge against other people, how do you do that? How do you work in a court of law, from the most personal to the most public? And then I'll be looking at how that relates to, you know, this idea of coding. And so that'll be right at the end of the course. So the interesting thing about use cases is that if you understand all of that, the use cases are quite interesting, because you can have AI that helps you in tajweed. Yeah. Even though, I mean, people will be, well, that's a bit too much, because tajweed seems to be the one that you have to sit, you know, knee to knee next to people. Yeah. But there is a case for, because tajweed is so labor intensive, meaning it needs one-to-one. Yeah. There is a case for filtering out the basics before you get to a teacher through AI. I think definitely that's the case. But the other fascinating thing, I was speaking to Sachi about this, you know, he's got this amazing book. I think I've got it in my library somewhere, because I'm actually scared of opening it. Let me just get this actually. So this is the book actually. I don't know if you've seen this, Search Foundations. It's actually published by MIT. Ilham Ashur as well. Ashuri also co-wrote this, Towards a Science of Technology Mediated Experience. So when I was speaking to him about this, we were talking about Arabic generally, because, you know, he studied Arabic and Balagha with me. And we talked about the fact that Arabic, you know, it's one of the longest continually spoken languages, but it's one of, I think, the most conducive to AI, because it's based on ishtiqaq. Its morphology is based upon this natural growth, like a seed that kataba yaktubu, and then all the things you memorize, you have one trilateral or bilateral root, and then trilateral, and then you just add, and it just becomes this amazing thing. So naturally, the language itself, unlike English, it has a natural propensity to be utilized by that. The other thing is that in terms of fiqh, and this is where the fiqh thing is really interesting, is that fiqh is all about ta'rifat, it's all about definitions. So when we talk about zakat, there's a really strict definition according to the Malikis, the Shafi'is, the Hanafis, and that's been written, and then it's on the basis of, you know, al-had, which is like a legal proper logical definition. So in other words, you've got the had with all of its specifics, which make it again conducive. Our sciences are all based upon definitions, and so that also means that it's going to be very, very conducive to doing fiqh. In other words, you know, if your friend that said, does this mean that it will take the place of your imam? It depends what your imam does.
Yeah.
You know, does he do fiqh or does he counsel? If he counsel, then you've still got an interesting, you know, kind of place there, because counseling again is about, you know, you know better than me, this is your area. It's about essentially listening and prompting people into unraveling things that they already know, and then, you know, at the end of it is kind of pointing them towards certain things. So the case for AI and fiqh is quite interesting. It's either we have to decide, is it for coding and codifying things that are already there? In other words, we've got lots of fiqh books. We just make it easy for us to search. And so you've got an issue with eating, you know, something or drinking something, or you've done something in Hajj. It will do a much better job than Google, because Google is very primitive. If you've used it for what you're using ChatGPT for, you realize that, you know, you don't want a million search results. You want one. And what it could do, AI could do, is to, because fiqh is conducive, because of Arabic nature and its basis on logical definitions, it's much more able to do that. But the dangerous one, I think, would be to generate fatwas. You know, in other words, you ask a question, I don't know what's a modern question that you could ask it, and then say, okay, what, on based on first principles on the Maliki school, what's the position on something that's just come up? And that would be interesting. If you train it on the Maliki school, you know, Bayan wa Tahsil and all the major works and the basic works, how would you get an answer? Train it on the usul of the Maliki madhab. That'd be really fascinating.
I think it'll come very close. A couple of years ago, Sheikh, we went to the Darul Ifta Misriya, and, you know, they showed us their whole setup, and there's different languages, and when they get fatwas from Europe, they look at the 4 schools, and then they extend it to the independent mujtahids if they can't find anything. But in my head, I was thinking that's all literally fed into the system.
Okay. So fed in what way?
So that's all processed in the system, in which the data is that full data. I don't know how, but imagine they could codify that and put that into the AI with its algorithms.
All right, so they use algorithm. That's interesting. Okay.
Well, it was very basic, but they were trying. But I think with AI now, they can, I mean, they'll probably put them out of business, but I think the system would be very strong enough to give us something intelligible to work with.
You know, so the thing here is, like, we need to know what AI is, we need to know what fiqh is, we need to know what fatwa is. I think the thing about fiqh is that it's very much, you know, it's like what Al-Jawani says, معرفة الأحكام الشرعية التي طريقها الاجتهاد. It's the knowledge of legal rulings that are arrived at through ijtihad. So ijtihad is essential. The process of ijtihad, juhud, jihad, it comes from this process of being really in this process of thinking. And it relates to consciousness. I mean, the thing about ijtihad, it has to have some semblance of consciousness to strive. You could say, well, the algorithm is striving, but I think, you know, what's interesting is that it's, for me, it actually relates to, you know, the sense of mind, the whole, you know, this kind of the separation of the mind from the body.
Yeah.
In European philosophy, it was very interesting because it meant that the mind is separate from our existence and our consciousness in some way. And if you can do that, then you can obviously make the case for the fact that algorithm is some kind of sense perceptive organism. But what's interesting is in terms of fiqh, you know, it's a very famous story of Imam Abu Hanifa and Malik. They met, and you know, when they left, they kind of praised each other. And obviously, you know, he said, Malik, he said that if Abu Hanifa was to argue that this pillar was made of gold, he would do it. And then Abu Hanifa says, "Innahu la faqih." He's indeed the quintessential faqih. Now, if Abu Hanifa stayed there and he waited for this man that came from Andalusia, he came, he asked him 40 questions, remember?
Yeah.
And then Imam Malik said to 36 of them, I don't know. Abu Hanifa would be going, oh, hold on, I got it all wrong. He's not really a faqih. But the point is, you've missed what fiqh is.
Yeah.
There's got this ethical ingredient, which is deliberation, and which is the capacity at the right time to do it. And so, you know, your chat GPT or whatever, your search engine would give you the answer right away to the 40 and say, Wallahu a'lam, or but you need to consult a specialist in Islamic law. But they've done all the tricks of the trade. They've boasted about what they know, 5,000 page article, whatever. And then they say, well, I don't know if this is correct. But the thing about that, I mean, Imam Malik said, I don't know. Imam Bannani, he in his Hashi on Jamal Jawami', he said, look, what he meant was, what we mean by saying that Malik is a faqih is that he is mutahayyu' lil ilmi indama awadat an-nazar. He's able, he's ready to do fiqh if he puts his effort into it, if he turns his efforts towards it, if he's free, he's able to do it. In other words, you go to a doctor and they ask for a prescription or a diagnosis, he can give you, or she can give you it, but they'll have to do the process first. It doesn't mean they're not a doctor if they don't give you it. It's a question of, you know, how that works. So I think fiqh, if you understand fiqh, then you understand like your kind of experience of the Egyptian Fatwa Council and how they create fatwas, and whether AI can create something similar, is that ijtihad relates to Arabic language more than anything else. As Shatibi said, it's like the key, it's the thing that is at the very core of it. And deeper than that is the fact that it's based upon something that I think will take a long time for AI to work on, which shouldn't be the case, but dalalat, which is like linguistic associations. And it's the way that you start to extract subtle things that make you understand why something is the case. You know the issue of wine, the prohibition on wine. The first verses of the Quran on wine out of the 4 are quite positive. They're just giving you a description of wine. And then you have the verse, you know, they ask you about, you know, wine and gambling, say there's many benefits and harms. And so, and after that, it says, do not approach the prayer. La taqrabu as-salah wa antum sukara. Don't approach the prayer when you're drunk. And then Allah says at the end, you know, rijsun min amali shaitan. It's kind of filth from the handiwork of shaitan. What's the purpose of not prohibiting it right away? Apart from, you would say, almost like training the human mind. It's almost like what AI does. It kind of formats information to the point that it gives out. It trains the mind to get to the point where it's able to understand the final ruling. And so that's something I think that, you know, AI would have a lot of difficulty in, because it relates to the kind of the shortcomings, I think, of it. The other thing about fiqh is really fascinating is it looks, if it's properly done, looks at the end result of something. Like if you give the fatwa, what's going to happen? You know, it's called fiqh al-ma'alat. It's to look at the end result, or the fiqh al-awlawiyat, which is about priorities. How do you decide priorities? How do you decide if something's acceptable, knowing that it could lead to something well down the line which is not what you want? And all of that, it requires inputs and oversight over AI, which is, I think, very, very interesting. And that's, I think, where there's a lot of scope for work, given the way that you process and develop the AI systems. You kind of feed it in data and it processes it, creates algorithms, and then understands patterns, and then it starts to create you know, answers. But I think the key thing to it is this issue of perception. You know, when you're using AI at the end of it, do you then think that this is a kind of rational being giving you an ethical, moral answer.
One of the other things that comes up, which some scholars touch on, is this idea of fiqh and mercy. So the idea is that AI lacks mercy. And I'm just going to give you a wee example. Go is a famous Chinese board game, and it's meant to be more tougher than chess because of the probability. 3 years ago, the champion of Go played Deep Mind, which was one of Google's.
Go is this one where it's got black and white.
Yes, that's right, black and white.
Yeah, and your task is to gain as much territory by blocking off.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah. So goes it's because it's a really big board. People don't know it's a really big board. It's got black and white, and it seems to be very simple. It's like Maltese, or not Maltese, like what's the other ones? It's like kind of kind of small round things you put on, and then it seems to be straightforward, but there's endless permutations.
So they got the champion, and it was 5 games against Deep Mind, and there's a whole documentary on this that they showed it. So Deep Mind won 4, and he only won one game. So they were talking to him afterwards about it, and there's a couple of things that came up for him. He said, number one, when you're playing an opponent, you can see fear, you can see emotion. I just couldn't understand what I was playing against. And number 2, Deep Mind.
Just hold you there. The Mufti is supposed to be the same. The Mufti is supposed to be stern and pensive, and especially Qadi. The Qadi in sitting in Qada, there's whole, Kitab al-Qada is like, there is stipulations that the Qadi should be just kind of this kind of picture of stillness and respect, that they can't do anything. And sorry, I was thinking we do have parallels.
And so the second parallel, Sheikh, you can think of is that when the game started, Deep Mind did a very different move in the 3rd or 4th, which was very unorthodox. But only at the end of the game did they realize that each time Deep Mind was playing, it was looking at hundreds and thousands of different moves, but it was also looking at the end goal. And it was very aggressive, because as humans, you start off, I mean, any football match, you start a bit calm and then you kind of go into it. This it was very aggressive how it started.
Yeah, it's trained for the end goal. So this is the thing in fiqh, you do look at the ma'alat, but with mercy. And so if you were to train an artificial intelligent system with the focus on the end goal rather than the right answer, immediately you would get something, I'd say, very, very simple. It's very similar.
So the point was that there was a complete lack of mercy in this game. It was very brutal how it just annihilated its actually opponent.
Yeah. So
how would that work?
An aspect.
Yeah. So how would that work with fiqh rulings, where we're often told, there's an element of mercy that comes in?
Well, it'd be easy. I mean, it would be the fact that that I think the analogy it needs to be given, the fact that was trained on that system to win that game, and it's about getting right to the end. Is, as you said, about mercy, and you could train it to give you examples of the outcome, which is maximizing ease and all that. I think that's not a problem. The problem is the major shortcomings that, from a space view of AIs looking at it, there's some very, very clear, I think, issues, because, in terms of intelligence, the kind of issue about AI is that it performs extremely, obviously pretty clear, extremely well on IQ tests, certain types of IQ tests. But the thing is, it can't do certain things. Like it has problems. In fiqh, the thing that used to damage my brain when I used to read all these, not just fiqh, this other hawashi, is the pronouns, where they refer to. Not like the modern issue about pronouns, you can choose what you want. It was like the damir, where's it returned back? Like you got 5 or 6 damirs, and they're all pointing in different directions. It, what's it? So you're thinking, where does it refer to? So one of my teachers should show me a technique of working it out. ChatGPT and AI systems have a big problem in just understanding where things go back to based on common sense. Like if I said, what's the, if I said, what's the title given, what's the title of the father of Sheikh Hassan's children? It's Sheikh.
Yeah.
But then ChatGPT would have a problem in solving that kind of riddle.
Yeah.
Because it's trained on a set which doesn't have the riddle as part of it. So it has this big problem with, things that are common sense to us, basic common sense to us, but are not trainable in a sense. And so that's why I think it's Ibn Farhoun, the Maliki, the great Maliki scholar, he's got a book on the training of students through riddles, legal riddles, and the way that you train great fuqaha to become, exceptional is to train them on riddles. And that's the shortcoming of all the systems that we have in terms of AI. It's all to do with the fact that they can't make sense of what for people would be like a game to unpack something and to actually to kind of take something and bring it back to its most basic form, that is a sense of human intelligence. So absolutely, there is a kind of sense that there is a lack of mercy, lack of consciousness. But the thing about AI, I'll to remind you, is that people end up giving it some kind of human face. They give it some kind of relationship status. It's like Alan Turing, very famous. I think he's in the £50 note now in the UK. Yeah. His kind of whole idea, the Turing test, is all about the fact that you can be duped into understanding that a machine is a human based upon the fact that you can't tell the difference between it and a human being's interactions. And he says basically, if a mechanism or a system like an AI system can get you to believe that it's human as much as the human who you're interacting with makes you feel it's human. In other words, if you're chatting to somebody on a text, WhatsApping, whatever, and you're chatting to two people, one is a bot, an AI bot, and the other one's a person. If you go to sleep not knowing which one's which, basically he's saying it can think. And so, if a AI bot that can produce a fatwa can be of a nature that you go to sleep thinking it's a person, or giving it the anthropomorphic status, it's done its job. But then the thing is, if you take that bot, is it thinking? Is it conscious? And is it, I was talking about agency, is it responsible for what happens if you do the fatwa? Like this disclaimer. Because for a person the sultan or the government can ban a mufti from giving fatwas if they go rogue and they start giving random fatwas that give, like a doctor or a qadi, they can basically strike them off. And the interesting about that Turing test is it seems to give us this idea that it has human capacity, human capability. But the interesting is, we know that's not the case. There's counter propositions to, the Turing test and whether it gives the sense of, anthropomorphizing it and giving this kind of human face, because, you could have a person mimic the actions or the processes of an AI system. You could give it lots of paper, lots of pens, and it could do the same, calculations as an AI system, and it could answer the same things. But does that mean it is able to do that? There's a kind of this Chinese room test where you have a AI system which mimics Chinese, and everybody thinks it's Chinese because it can, translate and it can speak. But, the test was that you could have somebody in a room doing the same task, but they don't know Chinese, but they're just doing the same calculations and they keep giving the same answers. You can't say the person knows Chinese. He's just doing the task. And so however deep we delve into this, when you strip it, it's just code. It's algorithms. Like the thing that you're giving meaning to is algorithms. And that's where I think, we have to be quite careful, is that, the replacement of scholars or the replacement of fuqaha in a way that, allows people to say, well, we can now, in a way that's revolutionizing, because the whole thing of Sheikh Google, it didn't exist, because essentially what you're doing is you're searching content that people have produced, and you're pulling it as a person. You're not following Sheikh Google. You're essentially using Google to search for people who are there. Now, Sheikh Google give you, Sheikh Ali al-Maliki rahimahullah, and that's, well, what's wrong with that? Or it could give you some, I'm going to say, it can give you something else, but the one that it'll give you is really popular, but it's, if it bleeds at Leeds level, scholar. But the other one's like a scholar who has like 10 hits or something. It's not the same. But with AI, it's different, because you're giving it sensibility, you're giving it this understanding of consciousness, of thinking, of being a faqih. So are you going to go to, AI? Abu Hanifa came, and he was chatting on his computer to this bot, and at the end he says, Wallahi innahu la faqih. I don't think he would, because read the story of Abu Hanifa when he was in his teaching circle, and everyone, they were discussing something like, I think, fasting, and everyone was like discussing, his 40, 50 students giving really interesting discussion. Somebody comes in and he sits, and he's got this massive turban, big robe. You probably know this story. And then all of a sudden, Abu Hanifa, who had a problem with his knees, used to have his knees stretched out. What he did is he pulled his knees in out of respect for this person he thought was a scholar. And then the person, at the end of it, Abu Hanifa said, "You've been very silent. Obviously, you must be some great." And he said, "Yeah, the fasting. What happens if the sun, the sun sets?" And he came up with all this random stuff that can't happen. Like, what if, the time for breaking the fast is before sunset? And then Abu Hanifa said, "Qad hana li Abi Hanifa an yamad rijlah." It's time for Abu Hanifa to stretch his legs again, because this person looked the part, but essentially Abu Hanifa is relaxed. And AI, in some ways, you could probably say, I can imagine doing a search and saying, okay, "Qad hana li Ridwan an yamad rijlah." It's time for Ridwan to stretch his legs, because there's blind spots. And I think that's the thing that I think we have to warn people of, that there's massive blind spots just from the technological algorithmic perspective. That's what Imam al-Qarafi wrote Kitab al-Furuq, because he saw shortcomings among scholars of his time, not being able to differentiate between things that look very similar. Kitab al-Furuq was a fantastic work, massive work on not the obvious things, but the things that everybody mixes up and thinks of the same thing. And what's the subtle differences that lead to scholars making the wrong judgment on things. And so essentially the test of AI and fiqh is essentially something like Kitab al-Furuq, where you're looking at how does a situation change, and how do you change your answer based upon the context. Like Imam Malik, alhamdulillah, I went to Hajj this year, and I was sitting after Asr, and we went into the Rawdah of the Prophet ﷺ, and obviously some people prayed Asr, and they said, well, can we pray Asr if we're in the Rawdah?
Yeah.
And I said, look, and this, mashallah, we were in the Rawdah of the Prophet ﷺ from Asr till after Maghrib, because the way the timings were, we were there, and they said, look, we prayed Asr according to the Hanafi school and the Maliki school, but so what were we supposed to do? And I said, look, I told him the story of Imam Malik. He went to Makkah al-Mukarramah. He went to Hajj once, and he was in the Haram of Mecca. After Asr, he sat down as a young boy. What sees him sit down, come in and sit down, and the young boy says to him, look, you need to do rak'atayn, you need to Tahiyat al-Masjid. And Imam Malik, it's not permissible in the Maliki school, according to him, to do Asr, anything extra after the Asr prayer. He stood up and he prayed. And all the students looked at him and said afterwards, like, what were the fatwas you've been giving us? And he said, well, the situation is different, because this young boy, he knew this hadith, and regardless of what I thought of the hadith, he said, if I was not to do 2 rak'at, this young boy's perception of the words of the Prophet ﷺ would be diminished. Like I've given, like the boy would think I've given somebody a hadith and they didn't think it was important. And so look at that. You were talking about mercy, and that's like straight. That's like something a googly. Nobody would have understood that. And unless he did it, you would never think he would do it. But that's fiqh. You know, that's the whole point of fiqh, is to sometimes be a faqih deep in your understanding, because you look at the end result. But you can imagine AI doing that, and then people saying, look, it's given the wrong answer. But this issue of consciousness, like the person is teaching a young child how to, you know, essentially be true to Islam and be reverential to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's, I think, is an interesting area where you look at, you know, the blind spots of AI and where it can tie into fiqh. I think that's where non-specialists are very important, because I started talking about, you know, super forecasters outperform specialists in their area, you know, across the board. The reason for that is, if you're so involved in something, you don't see the wood for the trees, as they say. You end up not understanding the blind spots that you have as a specialist. And that's why, you know, having scholars trained in fiqh, understanding fiqh properly, being part of the conversation of how to create systems of AI is, I think, really, really important.
One more question and then one more question in the Sheikh, and then we've got a few questions that people have asked. Last and final thing on AI. If we got a system and fed it the entirety of the books of Al-Ghazali or of Sahnun and others, and then asked it if Ghazali was alive in this time, what would he say? Would you listen to what AI has to say about that?
Yeah.
So this idea, you know,
no, I understand exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I understand.
You know, Aristotle, when he in his Nicomachean Ethics, the idea was that ethics is actually people who are living in their kind of context that we need to follow and understand. And in fiqh classes, we often say, you know, like, if Ghazali was alive, how would he understand anything? Well, we could probably get close to that if we fed the system the entirety of Ghazali's work, and it was able to pick up nuances in the intelligence of Ghazali and then apply that to some sort of modern kind of issues. What would your take on that be?
Yeah, the thing is, if you train the AI system on just Ghazali's works, and the thing about Ghazali's works and Ibn Arabi's works and many famous scholars' work, they developed. So Ghazali has a pre-seclusion period when he wrote some of his best works, in fact, like, and then he has a post, you know, seclusion part where he wrote the Ihya and Mustasfa, for example, like technical and spiritual books. You would be missing the context, but would it be worth looking at for insights? Absolutely. Because if you were able to train it properly, and you were able to what they call prompt engineering, if your prompt engineering was very precise to what his works would be able to be processed through, and it's in Arabic, I have to add that in.
Yeah, okay.
Because the whole thing about, if you translate an Arabic book and you miss the words, the whole semantic fields of Arabic are much more, you know, conducive to AI. You would definitely get insights and pointers, you know, like you get, it's almost as if, you know, somebody's passed away, and after they pass away, they're kind of pointing towards something. That gives you you know, there's a Turkish movie you should watch, actually. It's like a crime movie. I watched it on Turkish Airlines, and it was like, it was hunting. It's about hunting, and there's this person, you know, long story, but it's a really fascinating story. They're trying to find out somebody killed this young girl, and they don't know who did it, and they've got all these people, and it ends up being that there's this really rich man, billionaire, who needs her kidney for his daughter, and then but he ends up killing the girl, makes it look as if she died of an overdose, she's involved in drugs, but he puts her into contact with people that are you know, involved in drugs. Usually that'd be closed, but for some reason then the detective didn't let it go. Okay, and he kept persisting, and it was getting annoying for even the police officers. And in the end, he went to the house, and the one that was persistent got killed. But as he's getting killed, he did this sign, which is for him and his colleague, was to change your perspective.
Oh.
And so what happened is, after he died, they were looking for where he was, and they realized there was CCTV cameras in this place. They looked at the video, and he's kept doing that as he's dying. And so that thing, and they kept watching it, and then his colleague kept looking at that and thinking, what's that mean? And he realized he always used to say, change your perspective. And the change of perspective was pointing towards, it was like a picture. And all of a sudden he realized he was pointing towards this billionaire. And then it led to him being, caught. So the point is, it's not that he's going to give you the answer, which is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that perspective.
Yeah.
And that's what's, if you're going to make a use for it in the Arabic, I think it's definitely going to be something that's there. It's not an answer, but it's going to be some kind of perspective in a specific area. It depends on the area as well, if it's fiqh or it's usul or it's ethics generally. Ethics is timeless, so I think that's kind of done anyway. But the interesting thing about AI is that it's still, they call it hallucination. AI still is affected by hallucinating and imagining things. So you can imagine it hallucinating about what Al-Ghazali would say. That's like a big problem. And the other problem is that, there's a superficiality still, I believe, to AI and how it outputs things, because Shafi'i, remember, Shafi'i said, إِذَا صَحَ الْحَدِيث فَهُوَ مَذْهَبِي. If the hadith is stringently corroborated, it's my madhab. But that, he didn't mean if the sanad, he meant dalalatan. He means if I accept its meaning and its import, not just that it's got sahih in terms of its terminology. So there's all these things that I think you always keep in mind when you're using these kind of systems. And I think these systems will continue to fail on that. But it goes back to this thing, the Turing test. If you perceive it to be something that thinks, then given your experience of fatwas anyway, like substandard, there's plenty of substandard fatwas. If you are used to substandard fatwas and this fatwa's systematic, which one are you going to choose? The Turing test is, well, this fatwa seems to be much better than, something, yes, you can do it. There's no background at all. And so that's what's interesting about, I think, bringing to life previous scholars. So, inputting their knowledge and then trying to extract things from them. But you could take the audio, video, written material of a scholar after they pass away. You could say, well, what is the person going to say about something that appears well after their time? And you could make a video of them speaking about that thing.
Yeah. I mean, they did this with these music stars who had died ages ago, and they've generated their voice and they're singing new, like, Kulthum singing a new song or something like that. Yeah, it's crazy. But two things. One, recently I was listening to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's talk, and he, at the beginning, he talks about the ayah of Nur, and then he gives a 2-minute tafsir, fantastic tafsir, and then he says, "This is from ChatGPT." I thought,
so this is it. That's my point.
No, but you know what? Actually,
the Turing test is that you think that it's real.
It was, and the fact that Sheikh Hamza saying it, like, he'd say stuff, interesting stuff, but then he was like, ChatGPT. So I found that interesting. Second, I met a kind of prominent scholar a couple of months ago. He had to choose a book title. He had 4 or 5, so he fed that in. But he realized ChatGPT gave a better one. So he used that title. So things are quite interesting how they're being employed and utilized at a very minuscule level, but it'll be interesting how it.
Okay.
Couple of questions, Sheikh. Is the course okay for beginners?
So the Fiqh Coding course.
Fiqh
Coding course is, it sounds, what is it? It sounds scary. It sounds scary, doesn't it? Fiqh Coding.
Coding need to be.
You don't need to do coding. I'm not going to do coding. I can't do coding.
the kind of thing that came to my mind is Qawaid al-Fiqhiyya, the legal maxims are essentially the scholars using some sort of rudimentary algorithms that are not mathematical, but they're kind of linguistic, meaning-based, to come up with the most essential rules of thumb. So if you know rules of thumb, you're able to get an answer. Like, I had a retreat just last weekend.
Yep.
Somebody came up to me, they work in chemical engineering, and he was asking me questions, a real question that they're looking at producing meat from, like manufacturing artificial meat in a lab.
Right.
And he was talking about the fatwa about it. And I said, tabi'un. Like that, 2 words is Fiqh coding, because that's the first thing came to my mind. A thing takes the ruling of its source. That's the qaida.
Yeah.
So I basically, at the first level is the origin of that meat will decide and dictate what the ruling of everything that comes out of it is. That's the first thing off the bat. And then you look at the ethical issues, then you look at the harm issue about whether it's produced and whether it can create carcinogenic elements that create cancer, for example. That's later. But the thing is, Fiqh coding, what is right away, for me, I always go to these qawaid, especially on all the day-to-day stuff that comes up. The complexities are not in the books of fiqh. The complexities, again, you can't even get the answers from qawaid, but they're the things that point you towards, you know, this mind map, or essentially a flow chart of how to filter a question to where you can give an answer. And that's why it's really important, if you've got financial issues to marriage, ibadat, anything you can think of, it's something like, I call it either first aid fiqh or rule of thumb fiqh, which is, you know, a quick toolbox, or Fiqh coding if you want to understand it. I think for people are, you know, so is it for beginners? It's not really for complete beginners, because you need to kind of understand what fiqh is. You need to know kind of basic stuff about that. Wudu has basic pillars and things like that. And so if you understand that,
you've done the syllabus, the first year, that should.
Well, that's more than, I mean, the first year syllabus is, it's got stuff in there that, you know, that thing about human consciousness, you know, the first module and the first thing off the bat in syllabus is the purification of the heart module.
Yeah.
And it starts the definition of what the heart is. And it says the heart is the intellect, and the heart is the nafs, and the heart is the, you know, the qalb. So the reason why I insisted on that at the beginning, and people used to say, well, what do you mean, Sheikh? Like, they're different. That is our perception of what consciousness is. The ruh, the aql, the nafs, and the qalb.
No.
They were separated by Locke, by Descartes. Like, this is 400 years of separation. Before that, a faqih thinks with his heart, his mind, his ruh, his nafs.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thinks. And so the diploma course, like, the reason it's there is because when I teach it, I used to mention that the reason I kind of, these are all the same, is because this is undermining all of our kind of modern thinking about the fact that everything's separate. They're not. And modern science is coming towards the fact they're not separate. But so the first year diploma course actually is like more than enough for this kind of course.
That's why it's, I think, therefore syllabus that's the tagline.
Yeah, that's my own personal one. That was before ChatGPT. I didn't ask for, can you give me a strap line for this course that you're running?
Maybe we could do that. Maybe we could do that, Sheikh. Just for funs. But this was obviously against Descartes' dualism of I think, therefore I am. Second question, tongue in cheek. Why do we need Fiqh codings and Qawaid Fiqhiyya when I should be going back to the Quran and Sunnah?
Okay. So the thing is, is it tongue in cheek? It's a real question. The thing about the Quran Sunnah, you go back to it, and when you go back to it, you realize you need to do Arabic. You need to know the dalalat, which are the kind of indications within the Arabic language. Then you have to know the context of what you're reading, and then you have to know its relationship with other texts on the same topic and how they interrelate. How you have to look at the historiography of sequencing of verses and hadith. You have to then look at the strength of the text itself. So you have to do a lot of work. And so say you're a mujtahid, you do the work. And what you end up at the end of that doing is creating fiqh. And then that's essentially what you do. So if you're not a mujtahid, you can't do that. If you're not trained in the Arabic language, have the basic principles that your own basic meaning, core principles, and then auxiliary principles and usul, you can't do that. If you can, then of course you go there. But this is why I say first aid fiqh, rule of thumb fiqh. That's the whole purpose. If you want to do that whole thing, you can take aside 50, 60 years to master, 20 years to master Arabic language. Let's just start there. And then you're looking at, will you be able to come up with your own usul? You won't, because it'll be incorporated within the madhabs anyway. So therefore, it's not a non-starter, non-sequitur. But the reason for the fiqh coding and the qawaid al-fiqhiyya being important is, in this day and age, I believe, in terms of fiqh, it is the first stop that you go to, because it gives you a very close approximation of the direction which the answer will be in a work situation. You've got conundrum at work, in education, and you don't know, and it's complicated. The complicated nature is cut away by this qawaid literature, which is really, really important. I think that's why it's, really important.
Do we need to purchase any books or read any resources prior to class? And following that, would you perhaps recommend some reading?
Yeah, so so I'm just finishing off the notes. I mean, inshallah, tonight I'll have them finished. It's about 100 pages of PDF document we'll be sending for the course, so that'll be included with the course itself. So it's basically, I'll be teaching that, going through it, so you have that. So I like people just to concentrate. Well, I like, as you know, I like people concentrating what I'm saying, and then looking at the notes afterwards. And I like them to kind of go into things afterwards and not read anything. I don't like people coming in with preconceived ideas, because then you miss the point of the topic being unraveled for you from first principles, like the history of it, the words, things to look out for. Okay, now you've understood the history, who wrote about it, what are the basic ideas about this, what are the basic classifications, and then you go through the examples. It's all step by step in a sense. And through the long time that I've been kind of teaching classes, is I find that is the way that the whole class ends up successfully completing content and understanding a topic, is that they come in doing things as they should be, listening attentively, understanding, then reviewing the notes, taking their notes. Remember, this will be available to watch as a recording as well afterwards, after the stream, the live stream. People can go over it, they can pause it, they can look at it, and with the detailed text, the course text, inshallah, should be very beneficial.
Does it cover the deep fiqh syllabus, or it's something exceptional from deep fiqh?
Yes, the deep fiqh's different. Deep fiqh is essentially a book of fiqh in detail. Okay. So fiqh coding is the space view. It's like the grand overview. It's not going to look at fiqh. Deep fiqh is essentially looking at a book of fiqh from beginning to end, word for word. That's like the minutiae of fiqh, like word for word with a teacher. This course, fiqh coding, is looking with a general view over fiqh and looking at the patterns. Like imagine, I'll give you an example. Imagine oriental carpet behind me. If you're an ant walking over it, it's like changes color every step, red, yellow, green. Oh my goodness, such a chaos. Like when you're reading fiqh, there's all these issues coming up, thousands of issues come up. Now, if I took the ant and lifted it up and it looked onto the carpet, it would see the patterns. It would see, oh, makes sense, lovely patterning. And that's fiqh coding, is to take you away from the carpet and then to be able to see the overview and understand, oh, that's where fiqh starts. That's where everything fits up. Intention's important, removing hardship's important, local customs important, in terms of adjudicating how people speak. This is what's important. The literal meaning is important over the metaphorical in most cases. You understand, okay, that's why all these scholars said this is halal, this is haram, this is wajib, this is sunnah. You know, so it's not usul al-fiqh, which is, you know, looking at the internal mechanism, looking at the cogs behind the scenes. That's different. That's a different course. This is, you look, joining everything together and essentially connecting everything together to see, okay, that's why Islam is, you know, kind of takes those things into importance. That's why it focuses on these certain things, and that's why, you know, there's certain unity to Islamic fiqh that is quite fascinating.
Final question from me, Sheikh. I know usul for you has been your kind of forte, and I remember many years ago, even once you graduated, you had written on Jamul Jawami, and you know, is it kind of going through the notes for this course is it very much touching the old passion of yours? Maybe it's always been there, but you know, you've done so many different things over the years, and is it going back to like an old love, and you know, just
it's an old love which is built in old trepidation, because initially when I started doing usul, I found it very difficult. And I remember going to Umayyad Mosque for Fajr one day and staying afterwards. We used to have durus after the Fajr, before the Mahad, and then we used to sit there, and I was doing, you know, making dua that Allah open up my mind to usul, because it was so difficult. I didn't get the point. And then, you know, from that trepidation and fear that I had for usul, it ended up becoming, after 2 years, it became like a passion. And it just became fascinating, because it goes into, you know, you understand how the flower grows. Like, imagine a ruling is like a flower. You understand what goes into a flower growing and flourishing. And I think from the perspective of fiqh, that's why Imam Ghazali, his most, arguably his best work is his Mustasfa, which is on usul, which essentially is unique because it gives an idea of usul as a science which is so organic. He compares it to a tree which has branches and has roots, and then it has fruits, and the fruits are the ahkam, and he kind of compares it to this kind of growing tree. And I think with usul, I think that's the passion. Qawaid is different. Qawaid is the end result of it. Like, say the fruits that come off the tree, once you choose which ones are suitable to be sold in, you know, Marks and Spencers, and which ones are cheaper types, that's what qawaid are, because it essentially, you take the fruits of fiqh and you end up classifying them and categorizing them. And in categorizing them, you get an amazing understanding of what Islamic law, essentially what Islam's all about. Like, why is, you know, removing harm such a core, to the point that it's considered to be the most important aspect of Islam, removing harm. You know, like is Ibn Abdul Salam rahimahullah, he said that, you know, Islam is essentially about dar al-mafasid. It's all about repulsing harm, because if you repulse harm, you're in a sense gaining goodness. But you have to, first of all, like Imam Sha'rabi rahimahullah, you know, he had amazing quality of being able to explain things that are complex in the most easy way. He said, if I was to throw a knife at you and an apple at the same time, like, imagine you've got an apple and knife coming towards you, what would you do? Would you try and catch the apple or dodge the knife? You know, what's more important? You dodge, unless you catch the knife. And if I was there, I would have said, yeah, Sheikh, what if you catch the knife and cut the apple and eat it? But, you know, we're not Bruce Lee. We're kind of talking about basic stuff. Like, it's about protecting yourself. And then once you understand that, you think, wow, Islam is about protecting harm. So anything that removes harm is central to our faith. That's the kind of level I think is really important for people to touch base on in learning about Islam, is that what is the core? What's the purpose of our discussions about schooling of our young children? Why is there so much interest in Islam about, you know, ethical economics? Why are Muslims so concerned about the kind of ongoing controversy over the LGBT lobby, for example, and the kind of question of Muslim education? Why is that important? Because dar al-mafasid, it's trying to repulse harm, especially in a situation when we know that is kind of is experimental, like there's no purpose behind it. And so this is why the qawaid, you know, if you're a parent with a child in school and you're thinking, I don't know what to do, the qawaid like really do give you a kind of flowchart of, okay, I know if I keep to these qawaid, I'm going to be very close to what I should actually be doing.
And you mentioned about the kind of usul and, you know, the ahkam being this beautiful flower, and you really understand this essence of Islam. Would you say perhaps the most brilliant minds, scholars over the centuries have had a solid grip on usul then?
Yeah, because if you wanted to praise a scholar, you would say, تبحر في الأصلين. He basically fathomed the depth of the two usul, which is aqidah and usul al-fiqh, legal methodology, because they were pivotal, because they end up utilizing basically rational thinking to analyze the Arabic texts of the Quran and Sunnah to extract rulings. It is the pinnacle. It's like the jewel in the crown of Islamic scholarship. So the greatest minds, essentially, if to be classified as a great mind, you would have to be a master. Like Imam Juwayni, Al-Ghazali's teacher, rahimahullah, was a master in both. His Burhan is considered to be, as Subki said, it's lughz al-ummah. It's like the cryptic riddle work of the ummah. It's so difficult. But it was the basis of Al-Mustasfa. It's the basis of Imam Ghazali's attempting to simplify the structure of usul. And so, yeah, absolutely. Al-Irshad, Al-Juwayni's Irshad in usul, in Aqidah. And then, Al-Ghazali's work, Al-Mustasfa, and then his Al-Iqtisad, and all the other works in Aqidah. They're the two basic sciences. So if you want to mark great scholars, they have to have excelled in the science of usul and also in aqidah, not in fiqh. But Al-Ghazali did. Al-Ghazali, famously summarized his teacher's Nihayat al-Matalib 4 times. So he took Nihayat al-Matalib, he summarized it 4 times. He just wanted to flex his muscle, his intellectual muscle, not in front of people, but it's kind of intellectual muscle by summarizing it 4 times. So fiqh is really important, but I think in this day and age, you want what rules of thumb, you want a deep understanding of basic concepts. And I think like doing 40, which we're going to do in the course, is a very good start for that, inshallah.
And I think it's beneficial, especially now where traditional structures of any qawaid and any discipline is diminishing and almost gone. So it's quite important to have some
I didn't realize I went through the whole session without mentioning Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a principle, isn't it, of Islamic law? And Al-Qaeda is famous now more than ever not because of all the effort scholars put into explaining what Al-Qaeda is, but because of some rogue terrorist group. So Qawaid is a plural of Qaeda. Qaida is like a principle. And the whole point, I think, in the modern age is living a principled life. We always talk about living a principled life. Means based on principles. You've got principles. The person's a principled person. In other words, they're very upright and they follow a very specific way of thinking, which is systematic. I think that's really important for Muslims. Like to live a systematic, life which is not full of surprises. It's full of system. System gives you good answers, and that's, I think, really, really important, inshallah.
And obviously with the wider community, there's a sense of respect and admiration for that if you're so inshallah there's 3 live sessions, Sheikh, so starting on the 26th of August, and then it finishes with a live interactive QA. The link...
So finish off with a Q&A, but also it finishes off with an extra session. I'm going to be doing I'm going to teach the qawaid and the history first in the first 3 sessions, and in the end I'm going to do my own ruminations on how they all connect. I've got this thing in my mind which is north, south, east, west, and I'm going to go through that. So this is something you always like to think, because something that always bothered me is how do they interconnect in terms of, I think, the clock. How do they lead on to each other in terms of sequence? Which, if it's 40 qawaid that we want to choose, How do they relate to the most personal to the most public? And that's what I'll be doing live in the Zoom session, which means it'll be more interactive. And then after that, Q&A, and the usual Q&A that I have, inshallah, at the end of it.
Well, I usually say this for every course I offer, but I'm really looking forward to this one, actually, because I know it's been a passion for yours for many decades, and it'll be interesting how you've formulated your thoughts as you've lived through in the West, but with a deeper understanding of usul al-fiqh that you've had and the training that you've had. It'd be interesting how that journey is actually through this course.
Yeah, so that'll be the last live session where I'm going to, after you've conceptualized qawaid, I'm going to put this kind of perspective, which is kind of a modern reworking of it, rather than doing it from scratch, because that's you can't reconceptualize and restructure something before people understand what the concept is in the first place. Like,
Absolutely.
you know, so if somebody's new to it, you have to explain all the basics. And then once they've understood it, they've got an overview, then you can say, okay, I'm going to reformat it. And it's important for you to understand why it's reformatted, inshallah.
And we'll get, so the last session, we'll get that synthesis, hopefully.
Inshallah.
Okay, Sheikh, I think I took a bit extra time there, but alhamdulillah, I think we covered.
Shafakallah, inshallah. I feel that you're not well.
No, alhamdulillah, it's livened me up this. Alhamdulillah. And so Jazakallah, Sheikh. So Jazakallah, everyone who's joined in for this lively discussion on AI and qawaid and usul. So this is a lot of the things what the Sheikh, inshallah, will hopefully be covering. And personally, so no notes that the Sheikh's made is kind of good, robust notes. But what I think you'll get out of it, it'll be after the 4 or 5 sessions, I think you just be a very confident Muslim. You just have that confidence, you'll understand the principles, where they've come from, how they've been formulated. And you know, you just have the confidence to kind of follow them, inshallah. Okay, Sheikh, Jazakallah, and I look forward to you for the first session, inshallah.